Early in the morning of the 12th of August 1968, two Syrian pilots, Walid Adham and Radfan Rifai, flying MiG-17 Frescos, took off from southern Syria on a navigation training mission. Half an hour into their flight, Adham realized that they had strayed off course. Lost and increasingly short on fuel, he consulted his map. The airfield at Tripoli, Lebanon seemed close by, so the two MiGs turned south and began to descend. Minutes later, they touched down in unfamiliar surroundings. The airfield was a ghost town. They powered down their engines and waited for ground crew. A few civilians began to arrive, and then some more. Two MiGs landing in their village wasn't an everyday occurrence. They noticed that some of the civilians had guns, and slowly it dawned on the Syrian pilots that they were not in Lebanon, they were in northern Israel at an abandoned airfield near Betzet. They were now prisoners. Adham and Rifai would eventually be released 2 years later in a prisoner exchange. Later investigations revealed that their maps dated back to 1945 and hadn't been updated with the new borders. There have been suggestions that Israeli radio operators confused the pilots by broadcasting in Arabic over their radio network, but that doesn't feature in the official Israeli account. Their MiGs' extraordinary journeys were just beginning. They were first taken to Ramat David Air Force Base for evaluation by IAF pilots. The aircraft were first carefully repainted with prominent stars of David to avoid any unfortunate mishaps. Not the epitome of elegance or refined design was their initial assessment, related by Colonel Danny Shapiro, but its repulsive figure on the ground conceals its advantages. The MiG-17, in the hands of a skilled pilot, could be a true bird of prey in the air. Danny Shapiro generally flew a Mirage, probably the most glamorous aircraft of the period, the epitome of grace and panache relative to the MiG's functional design. The MiG-17 first flew in January 1950. It was a deep modification of the first-generation MiG-15, the success of which over Korea delayed full-rate production of the MiG-17 until 1952. Once it got going, though, the MiG-17 proved a big success. Over 10,500 would be produced by the Soviet Union and its allies between 1952 and 1969. It was the mainstay of the Soviet Air Force in the 1950s, outnumbering the MiG-19 that succeeded it by 5-1. Syria received 60 MiG-17Fs as they aligned themselves with the Soviet Union in the build-up to and aftermath of the Suez Crisis. Following the Six-Day War, more of the type were transferred from Warsaw Pact stocks to make up for lost aircraft. Although crude and largely obsolete by the late 1960s, the MiG-17 was still proving to be a pain in the ass. As the US ramped up its involvement in Vietnam, they encountered the Vietnam People's Air Force's small fleet of MiG-17s. Vietnamese pilots had been training on jets in the USSR and China since the late 1950s, but it wasn't until the 3rd of February 1964 that the VPAF received a gift of 36 MiG-17 Fresco A's and a handful of MiG-15 UTI trainers from the Soviet Union. These were very primitive aircraft by 1960s standards. The US pilots flying second-generation aircraft like the F-100 Super Sabre, F-8 Crusader, and F-105 Thunder Chief, and the third-generation F-4 Phantom had every advantage over the North Vietnamese flyers. They were better trained, their aircraft were faster, easier to fly, and armed with state-of-the-art air-to-air missiles, including the somewhat proven AIM-9B Sidewinder and the new AIM-7 Sparrow. Yet the obsolete MiGs were holding their own. Between April 1965 and August 1968, 27 US aircraft were lost to MiG-17s, including 10 F-4 Phantoms, 8 F-105 Thunder Chiefs, and 3 F-8 Crusaders. In exchange, US aviators downed over 50 MiGs, but the exchange rate was disappointingly poor given US technical superiority. A combination of Vietnamese hit-and-run tactics, underperforming air-to-air missiles, and an unexpectedly close performance differential in the conditions encountered over Vietnam were frustrating the US flyers despite their on-paper superiority. Although hardly decisive, it was pretty irritating. This shouldn't really have come as a huge surprise to the Tactical Air Command. Early in Rolling Thunder, they had organized a comprehensive test of the effectiveness of their latest fighters called Feather Duster. Air National Guard F-86H Saberhogs stood in for MiG-17s in the project, and the findings were pretty clear. If the Sabre was able to merge with the larger US fighters, then it won most of the time. The F-4C Phantom crews could counter by keeping the fight fast and vertical. The F-104C's low visual signature, comparable with the Sabre, meant that it was able to initiate a fight on its own terms more effectively than the other US fighters. Slashing attacks were the order of the day for the Starfighter, but even its crews should avoid a slow and low turning fight. Huns and Thuds should avoid dogfights and run as soon as they got the opportunity. Although the intention was to pass this advice on to TAC squadrons in Southeast Asia, it seems that communication was patchy at best. Compared to SAMs, MiG-21s and AAA, the losses were low, but MiG-17s were still shooting down American aviators in 1968 when Rolling Thunder wound down. The chance to deeply assess even early versions of the MiG-17 was therefore not to be missed, as the US aviation community reflected on 3 frustrating years. US intelligence had had some near misses at getting that information. On May the 26th, 1967, Lieutenant Vasily Ilyich Apatko flew his MiG-17 Fresco A, Black 25, into West Germany and made a successful belly landing in a field. US and German technicians descended on the plane and took it to pieces on the site. When the Soviets were eventually allowed to attend the crash site on June the 6th and remove the aircraft, they were furious at what they found, which, as you can see in these photos, was essentially a big bag of bits. Even the windshield was removed for later study. In early 1968, they obtained further intelligence from a crashed Czech MiG-17 in Germany in a project codenamed Have Bait. But these were not flying aircraft, and they could not be exploited in detail because of the politics of dealing with Soviet defectors. The Syrian MiGs were a different story entirely. The 2 Syrian MiGs were MiG-17F models. This version of the MiG-17 was more commonly called the Fresco C by NATO. The main difference between it and the initial MiG-17A was the addition of an afterburning VK-1F engine, increasing maximum power from a touch under 6,000 pounds to 7,200. For secrecy, they were codenamed Have Drill and Have Ferry. The captured MiG-17 were more generally known as YF-114. Although they were of the same design, the 2 aircraft were actually from different countries and were differently equipped. Have Drill, the main test aircraft, was actually a license-built LIM-5 from Poland with serial number 1C0718. It was variously known as 701, Black 1401, or White 055 in Syrian service, and was built in Poland in either 1956 or 1957. It served in the Polish Air Force and then was transferred to Syria in February 1968 to replace losses suffered in the Six-Day War. Have Drill was a full-feature aircraft. It had the scan-fix gun-sight ranging radar and the rear-view periscope that was intended to increase all-round visibility. Have Ferry took me a little while to work out, but I think I've figured it out now. It carried the nose numbers 933, Black 1033, and later White 002 during its Syrian service. I've not been able to locate its serial number, but I'm sure that it is not, as some sources have it, a LIM-5, but is actually a Soviet-built MiG-17F from the aircraft received between 1956 and 1967. Have Ferry had neither a radar nor a periscope. This in my mind confirms that it is unlikely to be a LIM-5, as the aircraft received by the Syrians in August 1968 were freshly refurbished by the Poles prior to delivery. All LIM-5s had both the scan-fix and a periscope. However, early serial numbers of the MiG-17F had the afterburner but no radar. As an export product, these could conceivably also have had an older cockpit as well, or it is also possible that the canopy was damaged over the years and replaced with an alternative. Because of its fuller feature set, Havdril was more representative of the MiG-17Fs that made up the bulk of the VPAF's fighter force. It also arrived on January the 27th, whereas FERRY arrived on March the 12th. It was therefore the aircraft that was properly instrumented and used in the majority of the testing. Starting in January 1969, the MiGs flew well over 100 sorties against every major fighter and attack aircraft in the US Tactical Air Command, Navy, and Aerospace Defense Command inventory, and was flown by a select group of Navy and Air Force pilots. First, the Tactical Air Command had their go, flying 24 missions split between the F-4C, D, and E, 11 missions against the F-105 Thunder Chief, 6 missions against the F-100 Super Sabre, and 2 missions against the F-5 Freedom Fighter to see how accurately that aircraft could simulate the MiG-17. The results were crushingly obvious. Aside from the fact that it had guns, when the latest USAF fighters did not, empirical evidence from Air Force pilots in Vietnam had shown that the MiG-17 was particularly dangerous at slower speeds and lower altitudes. As a contemporary assessment put it, the great majority of tactical engagements against the MiG-17F in Southeast Asia have been in the low-altitude regime where the Fresco C low wing loading and 8G structural limit are best optimized and utilized. It is the outstanding maneuverability the airplane possesses in this area that permits this rather old and simple fighter airplane to remain such a potent threat in this day of sophisticated modern weaponry. The MiGs had taken to exploiting this fact by orbiting in luft-free circles at low altitude before launching their attacks. This prevented missile engagement from above because the missiles would be confused by the ground clutter and dared US aviators to come down into a flight regime in which the MiGs were equivalent or superior. Because they were well directed by ground control, the MiGs were also better able to pick and choose their fights. US fighters had to deal with whatever they were given, often meaning their engagements started with MiGs on their tails. The MiGs were also fighting close to their bases, which suited their lightweight design that to an extent traded fuel capacity for agility. The MiG-17's combat radius was only 115 nautical miles clean or 215 with drop tanks. The US tactical fighters were operating a long way from home and often started a fight loaded with the bombs, rockets, and missiles they needed for their ground attack missions, not to mention the potential for pilot tiredness on multi-hour missions in complex formations. These tactical advantages were in many ways the essence of the danger posed by the Fresco. It wasn't some sort of surprise superfighter. It retained the MiG-15's challenging handling characteristics above 450 knots of indicated airspeed or 0.85 Mach. Colonel Shapiro found that at 600 knots of airspeed, full throttle, the MiG-17 would abruptly drop its right wing, and you had to invest a lot of effort with both hands to divert this dangerous situation. Pilot strain was a definite feature of the MiG-17. It retained the MiG-15's heavy, unassisted controls, unintuitive cockpit layout, and poor visibility, exacerbating the often challenging handling issues. The controls were so heavy that some Vietnamese pilots, being slighter than the average Russian or Eastern European, struggled to fully maneuver the aircraft in long engagements. But bigger pilots had their own issues. The cockpit was very cramped and the seat tight. Anyone over 6 feet tall was quite discomforted. The MiG also had poor stability in yaw that made it tricky to handle in many flight modes. Although relatively powerful for the early 1950s, in late 1960s terms the MiG's engine lacked power and responsiveness, making it relatively slow to accelerate at higher speeds. It also added little to no speed in level flight due to the MiG's aerodynamics. It did, however, give a sizable boost to climbing performance. Finally, although powerful when they hit, low muzzle velocity and an outdated gun sight that took 2 to 3 seconds to establish a lead pipper meant that actually hitting anything with those heavy-hitting cannons was tough, and with only 40 rounds for the 37mm cannon and 80 each for the 23mm, about 6 seconds of firing time, you needed to be accurate with your gunnery. The project's advice to pilots was, don't get hit. Very helpful. The MiG-17F carried no air-to-air missiles of its own, which meant that in theory, in a front-quarter engagement beyond 3,500 feet, the F-4 could attack with impunity, if its Sparrows worked. The US fighter community's basic assessment of the MiG-17 prior to HAV drill was essentially correct. Beyond its aerodynamic and avionics flaws, it was a crude aircraft. The cockpit had valves, literally faucets, to turn everything on and off. Basically, it was obsolete and totally outclassed. But the MiG-17 did have a couple of features that did make it a dangerous opponent. The first was its diminutive size. Only 36 feet long and with a wingspan of just over 30 feet, it was essentially half the size of a Phantom and literally half the length of a Thud. US pilots, who trained by dogfighting each other, didn't expect to be faced with an enemy so hard to acquire visually, giving a well-flown MiG-17 an advantage. Furthermore, the F-4C and D Phantom's powerful radars struggled to pick the small MiG-17 out from the ground clutter if the latter was operating below 10,000 feet. Pilots, jibs, and Rios expecting to have forewarning could easily be surprised. The detailed data collected on the MiG-17's radar signature would prove useful when the air war resumed in 1972. Secondly, the MiG came from a different era of aerodynamics. Although the performance tables show the superiority of US aircraft in most flight modes, below 350 knots of indicated airspeed, the MiG had total advantage. Its ability to decelerate down to those speeds was also notable. These advantages had been pointed out in Feather Duster. Sudden application of the speed brakes just wasn't an effective tactic. The legendary Colonel Robin Olds, the most successful pilot of Rolling Thunder, told a 1967 US study team that that little airplane can give you a tussle the likes of which you've never had before in your life. Their turn radius has to be seen to be believed. It's incredible. The advice to USAF pilots was therefore simple. Expect a small target that is hard to acquire visually. If engaged, use superior power and speed to control distance from the MiG-17 to stay out of range of its guns. Maintain speed to stay out of the MiG-17's zone of superiority below 350 knots and in no circumstances engage below 250 knots. This, incidentally, is actually more lenient than suggested in Feather Duster, which essentially said that US aviators needed to stay above Mach 1. Use vertical maneuvering to establish an offensive position. If the MiG-17 gets on your tail, accelerate and weave to draw the MiG into a flight mode in which its yaw instability becomes an issue. Or enter a 40 to 60 degree dive that challenges the MiG's ability to pull out and forces the pilot to break off the attack. The Navy then got their hands on the MiGs and flew 47 missions, 18.5 with the F-4, 16.5 with F-8 Crusaders. These images, incidentally, I find interesting as they show that despite some superficial similarities, the F-8 is actually significantly larger than the Fresco. There were 4 missions against the A4F Skyhawk, the only frontline US aircraft of comparable size to the MiG-17 at the time, and, of course, one that would ultimately be used to simulate the MiG at Top Gun. There were 4 missions against the A6A Intruder, one of my favourite aircraft, and 4 against the A7A Corsair II. The Navy's conclusions were in some ways harsher than those of the TAC. Engaging the MiG-17 demonstrated that Navy pilots had particular cause from concern. 100% of them lost their first mock engagement with the Fresco. Their assessment was that the afterburner on that engine gave it a performance level that could not be duplicated or realistically simulated by US airplanes with similar turning capability. Thus, US pilots were not accustomed to fighting an airplane with such an engine-to-turn performance combination. The relative age of the Fresco also led to a general overconfidence by US crews prior to their first engagement. Their specific advice was that US Navy attack planes should not engage the MiG-17 under any circumstances. No Navy fighter should engage the MiG-17 in a turning fight below 475 knots. When they did engage, they needed to maintain a high energy state, preferably above 600 knots of indicated airspeed, and exploit the MiG's weaknesses in rear visibility and high speed stability. In addition to the Air Force's conclusions, the Navy recommended heavy use of the afterburner to expend the MiG's limited fuel supply. Colonel Danny Shapiro furnishes further colour on this issue, saying that the rear afterburner was rather gluttonous and emptied the aircraft's tank in a very short time. In essence, the Navy assessors concluded that the MiG-17 was a dangerous opponent only if underestimated by their pilots. So long as they stuck together and took the fight into the vertical plane rather than engaging in a turning fight, a two-ship flight of F-4s or F-8s should always beat the MiG-17. The trouble the Navy identified, and the TAC did not, was that their pilots simply weren't sufficiently well drilled in air combat maneuvering to consistently win. For completeness, I should also mention that the Aerospace Defense Command also flew against the MiG-17. They flew 16 missions with the F-106 Delta Dart, 5 missions with the F-102 Delta Dagger, and 5 missions with the F-104 Starfighter. Their conclusions were that the F-106 needed a gun as fast as possible. The canopy also needed to be redesigned to improve visibility and radar warning equipment fitted. The F-106 was fundamentally an aircraft designed to do the shooting, not to be shot at, which made it vulnerable when exposed to other fighters despite its excellent dynamic performance. The obsolete F-102's vulnerabilities were already obvious from its deployments in the theatre. The study findings were essentially stating that obvious fact. Time required to fire missiles needed to be greatly reduced. It was currently around 13 seconds from breaking the arming cord to being able to launch a Falcon. And you were launching a Falcon, so there was that as well. F-102 squadrons should go from the standard ADC 2-ship interceptor formation to a 4-ship to give added protection. I cannot think that would have helped if the Deuce had gone back to Vietnam in any sort of fighter role. The VPAF MiG-17 and particularly MiG-21 pilots were quite happy to hit and run through large formations if they had the tactical advantage. Finally, the ADC concluded that future fighters should have a gun and be designed to be easy to maintain and reliable to operate. They were probably looking jealously at the MiG's stupendously high sortie rate versus their own aircraft. Have Drill and Have Ferry recorded 4 or 5 sorties each per day. They didn't have anything to say about the F-104 in the study. Perhaps it did well again and no one wanted to admit that maybe that fighter would have been a useful part of the USAF mix after all. A question I've seen raised down the years is whether the Have Drill and Have Ferry exploitation was worth the financial and political cost. After all, the TAC and the Navy had been flying against the MiG-17 for nearly 4 years and should have known all about its performance. CIA and DIA had acquired various intelligence about the type down the years, and, of course, the US had been the proud owner of a MiG-15 since 1953. Although somewhat different, the types were broadly the same in use, given the relative performance of the US fighters. If they were that bothered to test something dissimilar, they could also have borrowed a mystère from the French, as the performance of the types was broadly the same. There are a couple of reasons why it was worthwhile, in my view. Strategically, it was important for the US to continue to develop their ability to exploit foreign platforms for intelligence, even a relatively obsolete one like the MiG-17F. Tactically, there were aspects of the MiG-17's performance that were not apparent in the theory nor in the training against the Sabre. For example, understanding how to exploit its instability was useful. Furthermore, obtaining detailed radar signatures and precisely understanding how US radars and warning receivers performed against a real test article was an advantage that could be exploited tactically if correctly communicated. Communication of the results was where the value of the program really lay. It was an area in which the Navy succeeded and the Air Force failed. Have Drill was returned to Israel on the conclusion of the tests. Have Ferry remained in the US. It would be a hard-working aircraft from then on. In late 1969, a small group of instructors from the new Navy Fighter Weapons School at Miramar were also invited to fly against the MiG-17. The lessons they learned would be instrumental in the early years of Top Gun and, more generally, form part of air-to-air combat instruction across the Navy in the run-up to linebacker. The Air Force's conclusions were much the same as in Feather Duster. Their aircraft were fine, and it was prescient of the top brass that they had now fitted an internal gun to the Phantom. With that technical defect corrected, the MiG would be no problem. Better missiles would solve any remaining deficiencies. Pilots were, after all, just a necessary evil to get the weapons in the right place to destroy the Vietnamese MiGs. These were not, as it happens, entirely the right conclusions to draw. During the remainder of the Vietnam War, the Navy kill ratio climbed up to 8.3 to 1. In contrast, the Air Force rate improved only slightly to 2.8 to 1. That 1945 map of the Middle East really did the Navy a great favor. The story of MiG-17 exploitation related to Vietnam was not over. Under a program called Have Privilege, the US successfully exploited another license-built variant of the MiG-17, the Chinese Shenyang F-5. They referred to this aircraft as the YF-113C and borrowed at least 3 examples, Black 1024, Black 1721, and Black 1084 from the Cambodian Air Force. These aircraft were based at Phuket from March 1970 to January 1971. However, the mission ended abruptly when the 3 fighters were destroyed in a Viet Cong attack. Have Privilege verified the conclusions reached in the US and further broadened the Tactical Air Command's experience with the MiG-17. The Have Ferry unfortunately met a rather sad end. It soldiered on until the late 1970s, at which point the aircraft, which had really only been designed for a short career, was very tired. On August 29, 1979, Lieutenant Melvin Brown, call sign Bandit 12, was flying 002 against a Navy F-5E adversary pilot from Top Gun. He pulled into a high G turn and the MiG suddenly went into a spin. He partially recovered, but in a situation that killed many MiG-15 and 17 pilots down the years, he did not have sufficient altitude to escape. The MiG hit the desert floor and Lieutenant Brown was killed. He had not attempted to eject, leading his colleagues in the Red Eagles to believe that he had focused on trying to save a strategic asset rather than on saving his own life. A final casualty in the US quest for dominance over the MiG-17.